When winter stops being a season and becomes a threat, history stops feeling distant. The winter of 1944 didn't creep in gently across Europe. It slammed into a continent already broken by the chaos of World War II. There were no functioning systems left to soften the blow. Power grids were shattered, coal supplies cut off, and homes reduced to skeletal structures that offered little resistance to the wind. What remained was a simple, brutal equation: cold versus the human body. In that moment, survival had nothing to do with strength or courage. It came down to understanding. It's understanding how heat moves, how it escapes, and how to stop losing it faster than you can replace it. That's what determined who made it through the longest nights of that war. And that's why this story matters now, because the principles that kept people alive in 1944 are not relics of the past. They are rules that still apply anywhere systems fail and cold takes control. Stay with this, because what follows isn't theory or guesswork. It's drawn directly from lived experience, from civilians and soldiers who had no backup plan, no rescue coming, and no margin for error. They didn't survive by chance. They survived by learning how to work with the physics of heat and the limits of the human body. When heating systems failed, warmth became something you had to fight to keep. By the final years of the war, entire cities across Europe had lost the infrastructure that made winter bearable. In places like Berlin and Dresden, families lived inside buildings that no longer functioned as shelters. Walls were missing. Windows were gone. The cold didn't stay outside. It moved freely through every room. People slept in basements that trapped moisture instead of warmth. Frost formed indoors, creeping across floors and walls as temperatures dropped below freezing. The idea of a heated home had disappeared. Survival now depended on conserving body heat and finding ways to generate just enough warmth to stay functional. On the front lines, the situation was even worse. Soldiers in Eastern Europe faced conditions where mud froze solid overnight, trapping boots and stiffening clothing into rigid shells. Wet fabric became a liability. Once it froze, it pulled heat directly from the body. Movement slowed, hands lost dexterity, and simple tasks became dangerous. This is where the real danger revealed itself. Cold doesn't kill dramatically. It works quietly. First comes numbness, then confusion, then a heavy urge to rest. That final stage, when the body begins shutting down, is where most people lost the fight. Not because they lacked will, but because they didn't have enough heat to stay above the body's minimum operating threshold. The dangerous belief that a flame automatically means warmth. In those conditions, people turned to whatever they had left. Often that meant a simple candle. It gave light, gave the appearance of warmth. It felt like a solution. But this is where physics intervenes. Candle produces heat, but it doesn't deliver it in a useful way. The warmth rises immediately, escaping upward instead of spreading outward. In a damaged building or open space, that heat disappears almost instantly. Many people learn this too late. Sat beside a flame expecting relief, only to find that the air around them remained dangerously cold. The fire was real, but the warmth wasn't reaching them. This moment, when expectation collided with reality, forced a shift in thinking. People began to realize that survival wasn't about having fire. It was about controlling how that heat behaved. And that realization led to one of the most quietly effective survival tools of the war. Necessity forced ordinary people to become engineers. The most remarkable part of this story is that no one invented the solution in a formal sense. There was no blueprint, no official design, no factory production. Across occupied Europe, civilians and soldiers began experimenting independently, driven by the same problem. In Warsaw, families rolled paper into tight coils and soaked them in melted wax. In rural France, resistance fighters filled containers with cloth and animal fat. In German cities, people packed cardboard into tin cans and poured whatever fuel they could find over it. These weren't identical designs, but they shared a principle. Instead of letting heat escape upward, they tried to trap it, hold it, and release it more slowly. Through trial and error, patterns emerged. Some configurations burned too fast. There's smoke too much. But gradually, people refined what worked. Information spread informally through neighbors, whispered advice, and shared experience. What emerged was the survival heat candle. Not a powerful heater, but something far more important: a controlled source of usable warmth. inside the simple design that made the difference. At a glance, the device looked unimpressive. A metal can, some kind of absorbent material, and a fuel source. Each part served a critical function. The container, usually tin or steel, acted as a radiator. Instead of letting heat rise and vanish, it absorbed energy from the flame and redistributed it sideways. This brought warmth down to the level where people actually needed it: their hands, their faces, their core. Inside, the material, cardboard or cloth, worked like a wick system. It allowed the fuel to burn slowly and steadily, rather than flaring up and disappearing. This extended the life of the heat source and made it more efficient. The fuel itself varied. Wax was ideal, but when it wasn't available, people used grease, tallow, or any substance that could sustain a slow burn. The goal wasn't intensity, it was duration. This combination created a small but reliable heat source that could last for hours. It didn't warm entire rooms, but it did something more important. It kept the human body functioning. Why radiant heat mattered more than hot air. The key breakthrough wasn't the flame itself, it was the shift from rising heat to radiant heat. An open flame heats the air, but warm air rises quickly and disperses. Radiant heat behaves differently, travels outward, directly warming surfaces and skin. This distinction is critical in survival situations. The human body doesn't need a warm room to survive. It needs to maintain its internal temperature. Radiant heat supports that directly. This principle isn't new. Ancient systems used it long before the war. The Roman hypocaust circulated heat beneath floors to warm living spaces. Traditional masonry stoves in northern Europe stored heat in thick walls and released it slowly over time. The survival heat candle followed the same logic, just on a much smaller scale. It turned a weak, fleeting flame into a steady source of warmth that the body could actually use. The biological reality that made small heat sources effective. What makes this story so powerful is how little heat was actually required to make a difference. Hypothermia begins when the body's core temperature drops below a critical point. But preventing that drop doesn't require dramatic warmth. It only requires maintaining a narrow margin. If circulation in the hands and extremities stays active, the body can continue functioning. If the core temperature remains stable, even by a small amount, the downward spiral can be avoided. This is why the heat candle worked. It didn't make people comfortable, kept them just above the threshold where the body begins to fail. And in survival, that margin is everything. When people learned to multiply heat instead of chasing more fuel, as conditions worsened, people discovered something even more effective. One heat candle was useful. Several, placed together and partially enclosed, could create a far more stable heat source. By placing a pot or container over multiple candles, they created a form of thermal mass. The container absorbed heat and then released it gradually, extending its effect even after the flames weakened. This transformed short bursts of heat into sustained warmth. It was, in effect, a primitive heat exchanger built from scraps. Again, no one taught this. It emerged independently in different places, driven by the same need and the same observations. The lesson here is clear. Survival isn't about having more resources. It's about using what you have more effectively. The invisible danger that came with every flame. For all its effectiveness, the heat candle came with a risk that proved just as deadly as the cold. In enclosed spaces, burning fuel consumes oxygen and produces carbon monoxide. This gas has no smell, no warning signs, and no immediate symptoms. People exposed to it often never realized what was happening. Those who survived understood one critical rule: ventilation was non-negotiable. Even in freezing conditions, they allowed air to circulate. A small opening could mean the difference between life and death. Those who sealed themselves in completely often didn't survive. The heat they tried to preserve turned against them. This is the part of survival that is often overlooked. Managing heat also means managing air. One without the other is useless. Why the limits of this method are what make it so important. The heat candle was never a complete solution. It couldn't heat a building. It couldn't replace a proper system. It had clear limitations. But those limitations highlight its true value. It was just enough. In extreme cold, survival doesn't require comfort. It requires staying above the point where the body shuts down. The heat candle provided that margin. It created a small zone where life could continue, even when everything else had failed. That's what makes it one of the most important survival lessons from the war. Not because it was powerful, but because it was effective within its limits. Why this lesson still matters today. The people who endured that winter weren't fundamentally different from anyone today. They didn't have access to advanced tools or modern knowledge. What they had was observation, adaptation, and a willingness to learn quickly under pressure. They understood that survival is not about hoping for better conditions. It's about working with reality as it is. They learned how heat behaves, how the body responds, and how to bridge the gap between the two. That knowledge is still relevant. Systems can fail. Environments can turn hostile. And when they do, the difference between life and death often comes down to simple, practical understanding. History doesn't exist to entertain. It exists to teach. And in this case, the lesson is direct and uncompromising. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Survival is not about having more. It's about using what you have with precision and awareness. If you value this kind of deep, practical history, where every lesson has real-world application, make sure to subscribe to Intelligent Survival and share this with someone who takes preparedness seriously.